There's a photograph from 1924. A family sits at a dinner table in rural Pennsylvania. The food looks different. Not in an obvious way, but if you study it long enough, you start to notice what's missing. The textures, the colors, the way light falls on surfaces that don't quite gleam the way you'd expect. By the time that child at the table turned 70, the food on American tables had been fundamentally rewritten. Not through war, not through famine, but through something quieter, something presented as progress. This is about what happened when an entire population became the subject of an experiment they never agreed to participate in. An experiment with no control group, no end date, and no one watching the results. In 1900, the average American consumed approximately 1 pound of sugar per week. Most of it came from sources they could see. A spoonful in coffee, a slice of pie on Sunday, honey from a local beekeeper, molasses and baked beans. Butter came from cream. Bread came from flour, water, salt, and thyme. Milk separated naturally, the cream rising to the top overnight. These weren't virtuous choices. This was simply what food was. The Industrial Revolution had already transformed how people worked, where they lived, how they moved through the world. But the food system still operated on principles that would have been recognizable to someone from a century earlier. Seasonal, regional, slow. Then something shifted. It started with margarine. Developed in France in 1869, it arrived in America as a cheap substitute for butter. The dairy industry fought it. Laws were passed requiring it to be dyed pink to make it less appealing. But the resistance was temporary. During World War II, butter was rationed. Margarine became patriotic. What most people didn't know was what margarine actually was. Vegetable oils, hardened through a process called hydrogenation. The same process that would later be identified as creating trans fats, the only type of fat with no safe level of consumption according to the World Health Organization. But that wouldn't be widely acknowledged until the 1990s. 70 years of margarine on toast, in cookies, spread on vegetables. The sugar industry was watching and learning. In the 1960s, internal documents from the Sugar Research Foundation revealed a coordinated effort to shift blame for heart disease away from sugar and onto fat. They paid Harvard researchers to publish studies minimizing sugar's role. The papers were published in the New England Journal of Medicine. No conflicts of interest were disclosed. For decades afterward, fat became the enemy. Low-fat products flooded grocery stores. But when you remove fat from food, you remove flavor. So something had to replace it. That something was sugar, and corn syrup, and dozens of other sweeteners with names most people couldn't pronounce. By the year 2000, the average American was consuming over 150 pounds of sugar per year, 40 pounds more than in 1950. Most of it hidden. In bread, in salad dressing, in pasta sauce, in products that had never contained sugar before. The guidelines told people to eat less fat, so they did, and they gained weight. High-fructose corn syrup entered the food supply in the 1970s. It was cheaper than sugar, sweeter, easier to transport. It dissolved smoothly into liquids. By the mid-1980s, Coca-Cola and Pepsi had both switched their formulas. The human body processes fructose differently than glucose. Glucose triggers insulin, which signals satiety. Fructose bypasses that system. It goes directly to the liver, where it's converted to fat. The brain never receives the signal that you've had enough. No one explained this to the families buying soda. Around the same time, partially hydrogenated oils became ubiquitous. Crisco had been around since 1911, but by the 1980s, trans fats were everywhere. Fast food was fried in it, cookies were made with it, microwave popcorn, coffee creamer, frozen dinners. The FDA didn't require trans fats to be listed on nutrition labels until 2006, 30 years after evidence began mounting that they were dangerous. Bread changed too. What had once required hours of fermentation was now produced in minutes. Dough conditioners, preservatives, emulsifiers. A loaf could sit on a shelf for weeks without molding. This was called an improvement. Traditional sourdough contains enzymes that break down gluten and phytic acid, making nutrients more bioavailable. Industrial bread skips this process. The wheat is different too. Modern dwarf wheat, bred for higher yields, contains different protein structures than older varieties. Some researchers believe this partly explains the rise in gluten sensitivity. Others disagree. The studies are ongoing. Meat changed. In 1950, it took 16 weeks to raise a chicken to market weight. By 2000, it took 6 weeks. Selective breeding, confined feeding operations, growth promoters. The muscle tissue grew faster than the bone structure could support. Many chickens can't stand for long without pain. Cattle were moved off grass and into feedlots. Corn-fed beef fattens faster, but the fatty acid profile shifts. Grass-fed beef has a higher ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids. Grain-fed beef reverses this. The American diet went from an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of around 4:1 to nearly 20:1. Inflammation became background noise in millions of bodies. Processed foods were marketed as modern, convenient, scientific. There were campaigns in schools. Nutritionists were training using materials funded by food companies. Doctors received little to no education in nutrition. The system reinforced itself. In 1980, the obesity rate in American adults was 15%. By 2000, it was 30%. By 2020, it was 42%. The change happened within a single generation. Type 2 diabetes followed a similar trajectory. Once called adult-onset diabetes, it began appearing in children. Fatty liver disease, previously associated with alcoholism, started showing up in teenagers who'd never had a drink. The common factor was fructose consumption. Autism diagnoses rose. ADHD diagnoses rose. Allergies became more common. Asthma, autoimmune conditions, infertility, early puberty in girls, declining testosterone in men. Were these connected to the food supply? Some researchers said yes. Others pointed to better diagnosis, changing criteria, increased awareness. But the timeline kept pace with the changes in what people ate. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, was approved for use in 1974. By the 1990s, it was being sprayed directly on wheat, oats, and barley just before harvest to speed up drying. This practice, called desiccation, meant the chemical was present in higher concentrations in the final product. Glyphosate is now detectable in most non-organic oats, in honey, in breast milk. The manufacturer said it was safe. The EPA agreed. Independent researchers found it disrupted gut bacteria. The debate continues. Microplastics entered the conversation later. They've now been found in human blood, lungs, and placentas. Much of the exposure comes from food packaging. Heating food in plastic containers releases more particles. The long-term effects are unknown because the studies haven't had time to conclude. BPA, used in can linings and receipts, mimics estrogen. It was eventually phased out of baby bottles after public pressure. It was replaced with BPS and BPF, chemicals that appear to have similar effects but hadn't yet been studied as thoroughly. The pattern repeated. Replace one problem with another that hasn't been examined long enough to cause alarm. Meanwhile, the food kept changing. Labels became longer, ingredient lists filled with polysyllabic compounds, natural flavors, which could mean any of hundreds of proprietary chemicals, enriched flour, stripped of nutrients during processing and then fortified with synthetic versions. People kept eating. They didn't feel well, but they didn't know why. Doctors ran tests. Everything came back normal. You're just stressed. You need to exercise more. Try this medication. The medication often had side effects that required another medication. Children born in the year 2000 are now young adults. They've never known a food system that wasn't industrialized. To them, this is what food is. Many of them struggle with focus, with mood regulation, with energy levels that swing wildly throughout the day. They're told this is normal, that everyone feels this way. Studies on anxiety and depression in young people show sharp increases beginning in the early 2010s. Some attribute this to smartphones and social media. Others point to economic instability. Few mention the fact that these individuals have been consuming ultra-processed foods since infancy, that their gut microbiomes, which communicate directly with the brain, were shaped by a diet that didn't exist in nature. Fertility rates are dropping across the developed world. Sperm counts in men have declined by over 50% since the 1970s. Miscarriage rates are higher. The age of first menstruation has dropped from an average of 16 in 1900 to 12 today. Environmental factors are suspected. Endocrine disruptors in food and packaging, hormones in meat and dairy. But the research is fragmented, underfunded, and complicated by industry influence. What's certain is that something changed, and it changed quickly. The generation that grew up eating TV dinners and drinking Tang is now in their 70s. They're managing diabetes, heart disease, cognitive decline. Their children are following similar patterns, but earlier. Their grandchildren are starting from a more compromised baseline. There's a concept in biology called epigenetics. It suggests that environmental factors can alter how genes are expressed, and that these changes can be passed down through generations. If a pregnant woman is exposed to certain chemicals, her child may carry those effects, and possibly her grandchildren. The food supply became the environment, and no one opted out, because opting out required knowledge most people didn't have, money most people didn't have, and time most people didn't have. There's a farmer's market in Portland, Oregon, where you can buy vegetables that look like the ones from that 1924 photograph. They're smaller, irregularly shaped. They spoil quickly. They cost more than the ones in the supermarket. Some people seek these foods out. They read labels. They avoid seed oils. They question what normal means. But they're in the minority, and they're often dismissed as extreme, orthorexic, paranoid. The system didn't need everyone to comply. It just needed enough people not to notice. And for a long time, that worked. But bodies keep score. Metabolic dysfunction doesn't care about marketing. Inflammation doesn't respond to branding. And the people who are starting to feel the effects are beginning to ask questions. Not loud questions, not accusatory ones, just quiet observations, like noticing that the food in old photographs looks different, that grandparents who lived through the Depression and ate lard and butter lived longer than their grandchildren who drank diet soda and ate low-fat yogurt, that the guidelines kept changing, but people kept getting sicker. There's no villain in this story, no single decision that broke everything, just a series of small optimizations, each one making food cheaper, faster, more convenient, more profitable, each one moving a little further from what food had been for thousands of years. And by the time the distance was noticeable, it was already normal. The experiment is still running. The data is still being collected. It's being collected in doctors' offices, in pharmacies, in rising healthcare costs and falling life expectancy, in children who can't sit still and adults who can't sleep. No one planned it this way, but this is where it led. And this is only one chapter.